Today I'll be presenting on the traditional German Volksballads and their romantic revival. So for a genre that's been the focus of such intense discussion and critical analysis, it's surprising that the ballad seems to be lacking a single coherent definition. Some descriptions emphasize the possible origins of the ballad as a song accompanied by dancing. Others note the formal elements of the ballad's poetry, which are then translated into musical settings. For our purposes, we'll look at the ballad simply as a poem, typically set to music, that tells a story. In this presentation, I'll briefly examine the revival of Germanic ballads that occurred between the late 18th and early 20th centuries, specifically the ties between this movement and the more traditional Volkslieder. In my complete capstone research, I've analyzed works by four prominent German composers of the Romantic period: Karl Löwe, Franz Schubert, Hugo Wolf, and Gustav Mahler. I was originally hoping to do this as a full-blown lecture recital, featuring works by each, but since that's not possible, I'll be showing short excerpts of my own performances of works by one early Romantic balladist, Löwe, and one late, Wolf, discussing their treatment of the genre as a whole, as well as the individual compositions. But let's begin with a discussion of the elements of the German Volksballade, or folk ballad. In terms of their poetic structure, these balladic texts display a great deal of simplicity, which is then reflected in their undemanding musical settings. As with other balladic traditions, Germanic ballads make frequent use of refrains, either between verses or individual lines. Though these lyrical repetitions are typically tied to the meaning of the text, they're just as often meaningless words or phrases intended to contribute to the overarching mood of the piece. Though lacking in formal complexity, the narrative structure of the Volksballade is quite involved. Often focusing on a single, remarkable event, the episode unfolds rapidly, unbothered by minute or descriptive details. The narrative's delivery can occur by means of an external narrator, dialogue between two of the story's characters, or frequently, a combination of the two devices. The escalating tension eventually builds to a climax or point at which the trajectory of the story is suddenly halted by a particularly powerful action or revelation. The musical characteristics of the early Volksballade aren't all that different from other Volkslieder of this period. As one might expect, these works are straightforward in construction, utilizing simple, unvaried melodies with symmetrical phrase structures encompassed within an overall strophic form. Sung either a cappella or with simple chordal accompaniment, these works were intended to primarily to entertain and impress audiences with demonstrations of one's oratory rather than virtuosic capabilities. Being thus devoted to their audiences, it's presumable that early balladic texts would have been sufficiently basic for the common people to comprehend their meaning and grasp their dramatic arc. For this reason, Edward Kravitz notes that the language in these works is archaic or in dialect, with simple syntax and uniformity of meter, rhythm, and stanzaic organization. The Volksballade was an art form of the people, which required that it be presented in such a way that it could actually reach the folk. Any discussion of the German Kunstballade, or art ballad, must begin with the works of Karl Löwe, who distinguished himself as the genre's primary creator. It's Löwe, more than any other composer, who's credited with having brought the ballad back into the standard repertory of German music. Over the course of his prolific career, Löwe composed more than 500 songs and ballads, through which he redefined the genre as dramas in miniature that captured the essence of the poetry, not through the beautiful melodic lines that defined the work of Schubert, but through a sense of authenticity of narrative and mood. His melodies don't prescribe meaning to the text. Rather, they appear to rise directly from it, functioning as an extension of the lyrics themselves. Moreover, the composer had a profound understanding of the idea that the true dramatic force of a text lies not in its direct narration, but through the use of dialogue, placing the narrative in the hands of those experiencing it. Throughout his career, Löwe's ballads displayed little development in their compositional style. Among the composer's most characteristic works is his 1821 ballad Herr Olaf. Translated from the original Danish by Johann Gottfried Herder, this work stands out for its dialogical construction, as the plot is driven by four separate characters and a narrator. You'll hear the ballad's piano prelude begin abruptly with galloping sixteenths, followed by the introduction of the elf's seductive dance motive. After he resists the elf's temptation 3 times, a commotional series of diminished harmonies lead to the narrative point on the line, "She struck a blow upon his heart," the loudest and highest vocal phrase of the entire piece, after which the galloping motive returns, gradually diminishing until the wounded Olaf and his steed have ridden out of sight. So in this piece, you will hear, it'll start at the beginning, and it will lead to the dramatic climax or point.
freitet spät und weit, zu bieten auf seiner Hochzeit Leut. Da tanzen die Elfin auf grünem Strand, Helgenichs Tochter reicht ihm die Hand. Willkommen, Herr Olf, komm tanzen mit mir, 2 goldene Sporen schenke ich dir. Ich darf nicht tanzen, ich mag, denn morgen ist mein Hochzeittag. Tritt näher, Herr Olf, komm tanzen mit mir, ein Hemd von Seiden schenke ich dir, ein Hemd von Seiden, so weiß und fein, meine Mutter bleicht's mit Mondenschein. Ich darf nicht tanzen, ich mag, denn morgen ist mein Hochzeittag. Tritt näher, Herr Olf, komm tanzen mit mir, ein Haufen Goldes schenke ich dir, einen Haufen Goldes nehme ich voll, doch tanzen ich nicht darf noch soll. Und willst du, Herr Olf, komm tanzen mit mir, so Seuch und Krankheit folgen dir. Sie tät ihm geben einem Schlag aufs Herz, sein Lebtag fehlt nicht solchen Schmerz. Drauf tät ihm geben auf sein Pferd, reit hin zu deinem Fräulein Wert.
Hugo Wolf, like Wagner, lamented the decline of the Kunstballade in the German performance tradition, believing the lyrical leader of Schubert and Schumann to be the primary reason for its demise. While Wolf's later ballads would come to display a greater reverence for Loewe's conventions, one essential element that would never change was his choice of text, as Wolf, likely in an attempt to distinguish himself from his forerunners, avoided the classic extended text by balladists like Bürger, Schiller, and Uhland, choosing instead to embrace the more contemporary ballads of Mörker and Goethe, among others. Unlike Loewe, whose primary goal was the creation of a musical narrative to be expressed through the text, Wolf was far more concerned with presenting his stories directly to the listener through the music. As such, Wolf frequently employed leitmotifs similar to those of Loewe in his ballads, though to a much greater extent. Whereas Loewe employed leitmotifs in a symbolic manner of representation, Wolf utilized them as a means of depiction. This sort of vivid musical illustration provides listeners the opportunity to personally observe the narrative as it unfolds, not through the eyes of a third party. Wolf's 1888 ballad Nixe Binsefuß, or Water Sprite Rushfoot, is one of only a handful of the composer's ballads that deal with supernatural elements. The principal character of this text is the daughter of a water spirit, or Nix, and Mörker's curious depiction of her as a rushfoot perhaps suggests that she ties the plants to her feet to skate across the water's frozen surface. The opening ascending chromatic lines of the song, marked leicht und luftig, in concert with the high tessitura of the piano, establish a charmingly delicate, almost dreamlike atmosphere into which the Nixie gracefully glides on her rushes. While the musical setting contains an element of tonal simplicity that rarely appears in the work of Wolf, Mörker's text is another matter altogether. Though Wolf's vivid treatment of the poem provides listeners with a semblance of understanding, the narrative itself is challenging to follow for a number of reasons, the foremost being that, like most traditional ballads, listeners are given no character background before the narrative begins. While audiences of Volksballaden would likely have had some understanding of the stories, Mörker has created a pseudo-traditional narrative utilizing elements of Volksballaden, forcing listeners to interpret characters' actions and motivations for themselves.
Des Wassermann sein Töchtelein tanzt auf dem Eis im Vollmondschein. Sie singt und lachet Sonderschein, voll an des Fisches Haus vorbei. Ich bin die Jungfer Binsefuß und meine Fisch voll hüten muss. Meine Fisch, die sind im Kasten, sie haben kalte Fasten. Von Böhme Glas mein Kasten ist, da zähl ich sie zu jeder Frist. Geldfische macht's Geldhahn, tropf, ich will der Winter nicht im Kopf. Komm mir mit deinen Netzen, sie will ich schon zerfetzen. Dein Mäcklein zwar ist fromm und gut, ihr Schatz ein braves Jägerblut. Drum häng ich ihr zum Hochzeitsstrauß ein Schilfenkränzlein vor das Haus und einem Hecht von Silberschwer, er stammt von König Gottes her. Ein Zwerg in Goldschmieds Meisterstück, wer hat, dem bringt es seine Glück. Er lässt sich schlüpfen Jahr für Jahr, da sind 500 Gröschlein bar. Ade, mein Kind, ade, geheult. Der Morgenhahn im Dorfe schreit.
To kind of wrap things up here, I think it's important to state what I've already evidenced through this material, that the Romantic revival of traditional German ballads saw a variety of new trajectories for the genre. While Loewe was looking to its past, Wolf sought ways to modernize the ballad. Similarly, Schubert managed to situate it comfortably within his conception of 19th century Lieder. And just a few decades later, Mahler worked to establish a more prominent place for the genre within the context of Western art music as a whole, which he achieved through the addition of orchestral accompaniments and by seeking out new dramatic possibilities. In terms of their narratives, there's little distinction between the balladic texts of Möcke, Goethe, Bürger, and the Minnesingers centuries earlier. Musically, however, the Germanic ballads of the Romantic period display countless new conceptions of the genre's role, both artistically and culturally. And for this reason, a complete understanding of these works and their cultural significance is essential in understanding the musical identity of Germany as a whole. Thank you.
We've got a minute and a half for questions if somebody has one.
Dr. Ricker.
Yes, I noticed that you were singing about Erlkönig's Tochter, and of course that makes us think of the song by Schubert. And I'm wondering if there are other songs about Erlkönig's Tochter. I didn't know that she was such a thing, but evidently she's in at least two of these.
Yeah, and she appears quite frequently, and Erlkönig appears frequently as well. In these texts. Yeah, and I actually, in my full research, I get into a discussion of Loewe and how he, throughout his career, constantly was, because Loewe composed a version of Erlkönig just a few years after Schubert did. And so that was always subject to criticism because it wasn't as grand as Schubert's was. And so that kind of, Loewe kind of lived under Schubert's shadow for a lot of his career.
Well, who invented her? Where did she come from?
That's a great question, and one that I'd love to know the answer to.
Okay.
One more question.
Dr. Rice?
Yeah, Noah, how do you see this research impacting your vocal career going forward? Are you going to continue to explore this repertoire?
Yeah, I love German Lieder. I love the German ballads. They fit so well in my voice, and they're so much fun to sing, and the sort of stories that they tell are so interesting, and it's just a challenge both dramatically and musically. So yeah, absolutely. I think this will be something that I continue to pursue. I think it's just why you can't make a career in Lieder. You can certainly try, and you can have a lot of fun doing it. So yeah, I think that's